Researchers fed an artificial intelligence system to every surviving ancient text that ever mentioned Atlantis, every fragment, every philosophical dialogue, every scrap of historical reference across more than 2,000 years, and asked it to trace exactly where this legendary lost civilization actually came from. The answer it produced was not the wild conspiracy theory you might expect. It was something far more unsettling because it reveals just how easily an idea, even one openly admitted to be fictional from the very beginning, can spiral completely out of control and convince millions of people it was real. Here is the part almost nobody remembers when they talk about Atlantis today. This entire legend comes from exactly one single source, a Greek philosopher named Plato, writing sometime around 360 BCE. Every single detail people obsess over today, the concentric rings of land and water, the advanced technology, the sudden catastrophic sinking beneath the waves, all of it traces back to just two of Plato's philosophical dialogues, known as Timaeus and Critias. There is no earlier source. There is no independent confirmation. There is only Plato and the specific story he chose to tell. In these dialogues, Plato describes a supposedly ancient island civilization ruled by the sea god Poseidon and his mortal wife Cleito. According to the story, Atlantis was fabulously wealthy, protected by natural rings of water and land, and governed for generations by 10 powerful rulers descended from Cleito's sons. For a long stretch of time, this civilization thrived under a strict moral code, living in harmony and virtue. But eventually, according to Plato's account, the rulers of Atlantis grew greedy and corrupt, abandoning their moral foundations in pursuit of conquest and power. Their armies eventually attempted to invade ancient Greece, only to be defeated by the noble, virtuous Athenians. Shortly afterward, according to the story, the gods punished Atlantis for its moral collapse, and the entire island sank beneath the ocean in a single catastrophic night of earthquakes and flooding. Now here is the detail that changes everything about how we should actually interpret this story. Most serious classical scholars studying Plato's original writing agree on one crucial point. This was never intended to be read as an actual historical account. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian, and his dialogues consistently used invented stories and characters specifically as tools for exploring deeper philosophical questions about morality, government, and human nature. According to experts studying his broader body of work, Plato regularly built elaborate hypothetical scenarios throughout his writings, specifically to illustrate his ideas about ideal societies, the corrupting influence of power, and the gradual decline of virtue within civilizations that grow too comfortable and too wealthy. In other words, Atlantis was very likely never meant to describe a real place at all. It was a moral parable, a warning wrapped inside a dramatic story, specifically designed to illustrate what happens when a once virtuous society becomes consumed by greed and the desire for conquest. The dramatic, sudden destruction of Atlantis was the entire point of the story, a cautionary tale about moral corruption leading directly to total downfall, not a genuine historical record of some lost ancient civilization. So how did a philosophical allegory, openly acknowledged by most scholars as fictional, eventually transform into one of the most enduring conspiracy theories in human history? This is where things start to become genuinely fascinating, and honestly, a little bit disturbing, because it reveals something important about how easily good stories can escape their original intended meaning entirely. For centuries after Plato's death, Atlantis remained largely understood as exactly what it was, a philosophical thought experiment. Renaissance writers like Francis Bacon and Thomas More were directly inspired by Plato's use of an imaginary utopian society, using that same storytelling technique to write their own philosophical fiction, exploring ideal societies. Nobody during this era seriously believed Atlantis had actually existed as a real historical place. If you find it fascinating how ancient stories can completely transform meaning over thousands of years, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you deep dives exactly like this one. The dramatic shift happened much later, largely during the 19th century, when a handful of amateur scholars began mistaking Plato's carefully constructed allegory for genuine historical fact. One of the most influential figures in this shift was an American writer named Ignatius Donnelly, who published a hugely popular book in 1882, claiming Atlantis was a real, historically documented civilization, and remarkably, that it served as the common ancestor for virtually every advanced ancient culture across the entire planet. This book had almost no basis in verifiable archaeological or historical evidence, yet it captured the public imagination in a way that proved remarkably difficult to undo. Around this same period, other writers began proposing increasingly elaborate connections between Atlantis and various real ancient civilizations. A French scholar named Brasseur de Bourbourg suggested a direct historical relationship between Atlantis and ancient Mesoamerican cultures, proposing that pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the New World could somehow be explained through this lost Atlantic civilization. These theories gained popularity precisely during an era when European explorers were encountering indigenous American civilizations for the first time, and many struggled to imagine how these sophisticated societies could have developed independently without some kind of shared ancient origin connecting them back to familiar European mythology. This is precisely the pattern that becomes so clear once every relevant historical text and theory gets analyzed together at scale. Atlantis did not spread because of overwhelming historical evidence. It spread because it offered a comforting, exciting explanation during periods of genuine cultural confusion and curiosity, filling gaps in understanding with dramatic, appealing stories rather than patient, evidence-based research. Once that narrative took hold in the popular imagination, it proved almost impossible to fully dislodge, regardless of how many serious historians pointed out the complete lack of supporting archaeological evidence. Even today, the legend continues generating new theories with remarkable persistence. Some modern pseudo-scientific claims suggest Atlantis was actually located beneath the ice of Antarctica. Others insist it can be found submerged somewhere specific in the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, or even inland locations entirely disconnected from any body of water, resembling what Plato originally described. Almost none of these theories agree with each other on basic details like location, size, or timeline, which itself is a significant red flag for anyone seriously attempting historical or archaeological research. When dozens of competing theories all claim to have finally located the same lost civilization, yet contradict each other entirely on fundamental details, that pattern typically signals speculation rather than genuine converging evidence. Now, this does not necessarily mean Plato's story emerged from complete thin air, with absolutely no connection whatsoever to real historical events. Serious classical scholars have proposed several genuinely plausible sources that may have partially inspired elements of his fictional narrative, even while emphasizing that the finished story itself remains firmly fictional in nature. One particularly compelling theory points toward the catastrophic volcanic eruption of Thera, a massive Bronze Age eruption that devastated the Greek island now known as Santorini sometime around 1500 BCE. This eruption was genuinely catastrophic, triggering massive tsunamis and burying nearby Minoan settlements under thick layers of volcanic ash, effectively ending a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that had once thrived in the region. Some historians suggest fragments of this real historical catastrophe, passed down through generations of oral tradition long after the actual event, may have eventually influenced elements of Plato's dramatic sinking island narrative, even though the specific details, timeline, and scale described in his dialogues do not actually match the real Thera eruption with any real precision. Other historians have pointed toward a different Bronze Age catastrophe entirely, the mysterious invasions carried out by a loosely connected group of seafaring raiders, historians now refer to collectively as the Sea Peoples. These groups launched devastating attacks across the eastern Mediterranean during a particularly chaotic period of collapse, contributing to the sudden downfall of several major Bronze Age civilizations within a remarkably short span of time. Some scholars speculate that vague, distorted memories of this genuine historical upheaval, mixed together with other regional myths and legends over many centuries, may have contributed additional inspiration to Plato's eventual story. Still, other historians have proposed entirely different sources of inspiration, including possible connections to ancient Carthage, a genuine and formidable naval power that fought several wars against Greek city-states, or even the wealthy, sophisticated Achaemenid Persian Empire, which many contemporary Greeks viewed as a decadent, morally corrupt society ripe for symbolic decline within Plato's philosophical narrative. According to this theory, Plato may have drawn on contemporary Greek anxieties about powerful rival civilizations, using them as inspiration for his fictional Atlantis, while transforming those anxieties into a distant, mythologized setting. If uncovering how ancient legends actually formed and spread fascinates you, make sure you are subscribed, because there are countless more deep dives exactly like this one still waiting to be explored right here on this channel. What makes this entire investigation so genuinely disturbing when you really sit with it is not the possibility that Atlantis was beneath the ocean waiting to be discovered by modern archaeologists. It is something far more unsettling about human psychology itself. A story explicitly created as fiction, openly intended by its own author as a moral warning rather than a historical record, still managed to convince countless people across multiple centuries that it represented genuine, verifiable history. And once that belief took hold, no amount of careful scholarly correction seemed capable of fully erasing it from popular culture. This pattern reveals something genuinely important about how misinformation spreads and persists. a lesson that extends far beyond just this one specific ancient legend. A compelling, emotionally satisfying story, especially one wrapped in themes of lost wisdom, forgotten advanced technology, and dramatic downfall, can prove remarkably resistant to correction, even when the original creator explicitly built that story as an allegory rather than genuine history. Once a narrative like this becomes deeply embedded within popular culture, generation after generation continues repeating and reinforcing it, regardless of how thoroughly professional historians and classicists have already debunked its historical accuracy. Consider just how far this originally philosophical allegory has traveled across the centuries. What began as a relatively brief passage within two philosophical dialogues, intended specifically to warn against the corrupting influence of power and greed, eventually transformed into an entire genre of pseudoscientific literature, countless documentaries, blockbuster films, video, games, and endless online debates about supposedly lost advanced technology from a civilization that almost certainly never actually existed in the specific form Plato originally described. This raises a genuinely important question worth carrying forward into how we evaluate other historical and modern claims we encounter today. If a deliberately fictional philosophical allegory, created explicitly to teach a moral lesson about corruption and downfall, can convince entire generations of otherwise reasonable people that it represents genuine ancient history, how many other widely believed stories floating through our culture today might be built on similarly shaky foundations, repeated so often and with such conviction that their original fictional or exaggerated nature has been almost completely forgotten? There is also something quietly ironic buried within this entire situation, worth sitting with for a moment before we wrap up. Plato's original story was fundamentally a warning about the dangers of a society becoming too obsessed with wealth, power, and unchecked ambition, ultimately leading to moral corruption and total downfall. And yet, in a strange twist that Plato himself could never have anticipated, that exact same cautionary story eventually became a symbol of exactly the kind of uncritical thinking and unchecked speculation he likely would have found deeply troubling, a legend so seductive and appealing that generations of people chose to believe it as literal historical fact, without ever questioning it against the actual available evidence. So, when researchers systematically traced every single ancient reference to Atlantis back through more than 2,000 years of history, what they ultimately confirmed was not some hidden lost city finally waiting to be found beneath the waves. It was something arguably more important to understand, a powerful demonstration of exactly how a single compelling story, regardless of its original truthful intent, can escape its creator's control entirely, take on an entirely new life of its own, and continue shaping human imagination and belief for literally thousands of years afterward, long after the philosopher who first wrote it down has been gone. The next time someone confidently tells you Atlantis was definitely a real, technologically advanced ancient civilization hidden somewhere beneath the ocean, you will know the actual, far more interesting truth. There was never a lost city waiting silently beneath the waves this entire time. There was only ever a brilliant philosopher, writing a deliberately fictional warning about greed, corruption, and moral downfall, a warning so compelling and so vividly imagined that it eventually convinced the entire world it must have actually happened, exactly as he originally described it. Let us go back and look more closely at the actual details Plato included in his story, because the specific numbers he chose reveal something important that most people conveniently ignore whenever they discuss Atlantis, as though it were verified history. Plato specifically states that Atlantis existed and was destroyed more than 9,000 years before his own lifetime. Think carefully about what the timeline actually implies. 9,000 years before Plato would place this supposedly advanced, sophisticated civilization somewhere around 11,600 years ago, deep within the last ice age, a period when human societies across the entire planet were still living as small groups of hunter-gatherers, thousands of years before anyone had developed agriculture, writing systems, or organized cities anywhere on Earth. This single detail alone should raise enormous skepticism for anyone treating Plato's account as literal historical fact. According to the actual archaeological record, verified through countless independent excavations across multiple continents, there's absolutely no evidence anywhere on Earth of an advanced civilization existing during this specific time frame, let alone one sophisticated enough to build the elaborate concentric canals, temples, and monuments Plato describes in such vivid detail. The earliest confirmed complex civilizations, places like ancient Sumer and early Egypt, do not emerge in the historical record until many thousands of years after Plato's proposed date for Atlantis, making his specific timeline essentially impossible to reconcile with everything we actually know about verified human history. Proponents of Atlantis as literal historical fact have proposed various explanations for this glaring inconsistency over the years, suggesting perhaps Plato simply made an error in his calculations, or that ancient Egyptian priests, who supposedly passed along this story to the Greek statesman Solon, somehow miscounted or exaggerated the actual timeline involved. But this kind of after-the-fact rationalization, constantly adjusting the story's details to explain away inconvenient inconsistencies, is itself a significant warning sign that should make any careful researcher deeply skeptical. Genuine historical accounts, verified independently, through multiple sources and disciplines, typically do not require this kind of constant special pleading and creative reinterpretation just to remain internally consistent. There is also the matter of exactly where Plato claims Atlantis was located, another detail that reveals significant problems when examined carefully. Plato describes the island as lying beyond what the ancient Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules, a phrase referring to the narrow strait we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar, marking the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the wider Atlantic Ocean. This vague geographic description has fueled centuries of wildly different theories, with various researchers over the years proposing locations ranging from the mid-Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean Sea to the Azores Islands to the Canary Islands, and even, in some particularly imaginative modern theories, locations as geographically implausible as beneath the ice sheets of Antarctica. The sheer geographic range of these proposed locations, spanning literally thousands of miles across completely different regions of the planet, tells us something important about the fundamental nature of this legend. If Atlantis were genuinely documented through consistent historical or archaeological evidence, researchers would expect these proposed locations to gradually converge toward a single, well-supported answer, as more evidence accumulated over time, the same way genuine historical mysteries typically get resolved through careful accumulating research. Instead, proposed Atlantis locations have only multiplied and diversified further over the centuries, with each new generation of theorists proposing yet another complete-why different location, often based on selectively interpreting Plato's vague and admittedly ambiguous original description to fit whatever specific theory they personally favor. This pattern of endlessly multiplying contradictory theories is actually a hallmark characteristic of pseudo-history more broadly, not just specifically limited to the Atlantis legend. Genuine historical mysteries, the kind eventually solved through careful accumulating physical evidence, typically narrow toward increasingly specific, supported conclusions as research techniques improve and more evidence gets uncovered over time. Pseudo-historical legends, by sharp contrast, tend to expand and diversify indefinitely, with each new author or researcher feeling free to reinterpret ambiguous original source material according to whatever conclusion they already personally find most appealing or exciting. It is also worth directly addressing something that frequently comes up whenever people discuss Atlantis: the question of why so many respected, credentialed researchers throughout history have continued taking this specific legend seriously, even after centuries of accumulated skepticism from mainstream historians and classicists. Part of the answer lies in genuinely understandable human curiosity about our own distant past. The idea that an advanced, sophisticated civilization might have existed long before recorded history, only to be tragically lost to some sudden catastrophic disaster, taps into something deeply compelling about human imagination, our fear of impermanence, and our fascination with hidden, forgotten knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. There's also a persistent cultural tendency, one that continues resurfacing across many different historical and pseudo-scientific claims beyond just Atlantis specifically. To underestimate the genuine ingenuity, capability, and sophistication of ancient peoples working with the tools, materials, and organizational structures actually available to them during their own specific historical era. This tendency sometimes leads certain researchers and authors to assume that anything sufficiently impressive found in the ancient world must somehow trace back to some earlier, more advanced lost civilization, rather than accepting the genuinely remarkable achievements of documented ancient societies, working entirely within their own established historical timeline and technological capabilities. Understanding this broader pattern helps explain why the Atlantis legend specifically has proven so remarkably durable and resistant to correction across so many centuries, compared to countless other ancient stories that have simply faded away into obscurity over time. It combines several deeply compelling elements simultaneously: genuine curiosity about human origins, an appealing narrative about lost advanced knowledge, dramatic themes of catastrophic destruction, and just enough geographic and historical ambiguity within Plato's original vague description to allow each new generation of believers to project their own preferred specific theory onto this fundamentally flexible, adaptable, ancient story. None of this careful analysis is intended to diminish genuine curiosity about ancient history, or to suggest that questioning established historical narratives is somehow inherently unreasonable or foolish. Genuine archaeological mysteries absolutely do exist, and legitimate historical research continues actively uncovering fascinating new discoveries about ancient civilizations on a regular, ongoing basis. The important distinction worth remembering is between genuine, evidence-based historical inquiry, which carefully follows accumulating physical evidence toward increasingly specific and well-supported conclusions, and pseudo-historical speculation, which instead starts with an appealing, exciting conclusion and then works backward, selectively interpreting ambiguous evidence to support whatever answer already feels most emotionally satisfying.